The car horn was still screaming when Elena Marsh pulled herself out through the broken window, her hands shaking, blood running warm down the side of her face. The forest around her was black and endless, and the last thing she remembered before the crash was a pair of glowing eyes in the middle of the road. She stood on shaking legs, gripping the twisted metal of the door for balance, and looked around. No lights, no houses, no phone signal, just trees that seemed to lean in closer with every gust of wind, and a silence so complete it felt like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She had been driving to her cousin's wedding, cutting through the back roads because her map app promised it would save 40 minutes. 40 minutes. She almost laughed at the thought now, standing in the wreckage of her car with her ankle throbbing and her phone dead in her pocket. She limped away from the car, following the only thing that made sense, the faint sound of running water. If there was a creek, there might be a trail. If there was a trail, there might be a road. If there was a road, there might be someone, anyone, who could help her. The night was colder than she expected. Her thin jacket did nothing against the wind that cut through the trees, and every snap of a twig beneath her shoes sounded impossibly loud. She kept telling herself it was just an ordinary forest. Ordinary forests did not feel like this. Ordinary forests did not make the hair on her arms stand up the way this one did. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the nearby towns had. Blackthorn Ridge was not a place people wandered into by accident, and the few who did rarely talked about it afterward. There were rumors of a pack that ruled the land, fierce and untouchable, led by a man so dangerous that even the boldest hunters refused to set foot past the old stone markers at the edge of the woods. Elena had always assumed it was just a story parents used to keep their children close to home. Standing here now, lost and alone, she was not so sure anymore. The sound of the creek grew louder, and she pushed through a curtain of low branches, only to freeze at what she saw on the other side. A small shape lay curled beside the water, shivering, its fur matted with mud and something darker. At first she thought it was a dog, abandoned and starving, but as she crept closer she saw the shape of the ears, the length of the snout, the wildness in its half-open eyes. A wolf pup, barely more than a few weeks old, alone in the freezing dark, too weak to even lift its head when she knelt beside it. Every instinct told her to back away slowly. Wild animals were unpredictable, and a mother wolf could be watching from the shadows this very second, ready to defend her young against anything that came near. But the pup did not growl or snap at her. It simply looked up with tired, glassy eyes and made a small, broken sound that went straight through her chest like a blade. She did not remember deciding to move. Her hands acted on their own, gently scooping the trembling little body into the folds of her jacket, feeling how impossibly light it was, how cold. Its heartbeat fluttered weak and fast against her palm, like a bird trapped in a small cage. "You poor thing," she whispered, cradling it close. "Where is your mother?" The forest gave her no answer, only the whisper of wind through branches and the distant call of an owl somewhere far above. She had worked with animals long enough to know what shock looked like, and this pup was deep in it. If she left it here, it would not survive the night. She made her decision without a second thought, tucking the pup securely against her chest, using her own body heat to fight off the cold that was stealing its strength. That was when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She lifted her head slowly, scanning the tree line, and her breath caught in her throat. There, standing perfectly still between two ancient oaks, was the largest wolf she had ever seen in her life. Its fur was dark as midnight, its eyes a shade of gold so bright they seemed to glow from within. It did not move. It did not growl. It simply watched her with an intelligence that felt far too human for something with claws and fangs. Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain the wolf could hear it. She had read once that you were never supposed to run from a predator, that running triggered something ancient and unstoppable in their instincts. So she stood frozen, the pup clutched tightly against her chest, and stared back at the massive animal that seemed to be studying her from across the clearing. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Neither of them moved. The wind rustled through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth, and somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked, sharp as a gunshot in the quiet. The wolf's ears flicked toward the sound, but its gaze never left her face. Then, slowly, impossibly, the shape in front of her began to shift. Elena had heard the legends about Blackthorn Ridge, Whispered stories that most people dismissed as folklore, tales of creatures that walked as beasts by moonlight and as men in daylight. She had never believed a single word of it. Standing here now, watching the massive wolf rise onto two legs, its fur receding into pale skin, its powerful frame reshaping itself into something unmistakably human, she realized how wrong she had been. Within moments, a man stood where the wolf had been, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in nothing but a pair of worn trousers that had somehow survived the transformation. His hair was dark, almost black, falling loosely around a face, carved from hard lines and quiet authority. But it was his eyes that held her captive, the same piercing gold that had watched her from the wolf's face, now set into human features that looked like they had never once needed to ask permission for anything. "You should not be here," he said. His voice was low, controlled, carrying a weight that made the words feel less like a warning and more like a fact of nature, as unchangeable as gravity. Elena's mouth went dry. "I know," she managed to say. "My car crashed. I did not mean to." His gaze dropped to the bundle in her arms, and something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to name. "That is one of mine," he said, stepping closer, each movement deliberate and unhurried, the walk of someone who had never once needed to rush because the world simply waited for him. Elena instinctively tightened her hold on the pup. "It is hurt," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. "It was alone by the creek, freezing. I could not just leave it there." The man stopped a few feet away, studying her with an intensity that made her feel like he was reading every thought behind her eyes. "You do not understand what you have wandered into," he said. "This is Blackthorn Ridge, my territory, my pack. Humans do not come here, and the ones who do rarely leave the way they arrived." Fear should have swallowed her whole in that moment. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she was standing alone in the dark, with a man who had just turned from a wolf into a human being right in front of her, in territory that even the locals refused to enter. But there was something else underneath the fear, something steadier, a certainty that settled into her bones and refused to move. She looked down at the pup shivering weakly against her chest, its tiny body still fighting to hold on to whatever warmth it could find. "Then let me help it first," she said, lifting her chin, "and after that, you can do whatever you want with me. But I am not putting this pup back down in the cold to die just because you say I am not supposed to be here." For a long moment, the man simply stared at her, and Elena had the strange feeling that no one had spoken to him that way in a very long time, if ever. Something shifted behind his golden eyes, a flicker of surprise, maybe even something close to respect. Though it vanished so quickly, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he asked quietly. "I have a guess," she admitted, "but right now I do not care. This pup is dying. Are you going to help me or not?" The silence that followed felt endless. Somewhere in the trees, another set of eyes watched from the shadows, and Elena realized with a jolt that they were not alone, that others from his pack were nearby, waiting, watching to see what their leader would do. Finally, the man exhaled, a sound that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "My name is Cade Ashgrove," he said. "I am the alpha of this territory, and every creature within these woods answers to me. That pup you are holding belongs to my pack, born 3 days ago to a mother who did not survive the birth. It has no one." Elena's chest tightened at the words. "Then it needs someone even more," she said softly. Cade studied her for another long moment, his expression unreadable, before he finally spoke again. "There is a cabin at the edge of my territory," he said. "It was built long ago, meant for humans, who occasionally passed through and needed shelter. You will go there. You will treat the pup if you can, and then, at first light, you will leave this place and never return." It was not a request. Elena understood that much from the tone of his voice, the finality that left no room for argument. But she also understood, somewhere deep down, that she had just been given a chance most humans who stumbled into Blackthorn Ridge never received. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me yet," Cade said, turning to lead the way through the trees, his broad shoulders disappearing into the shadows ahead of her. "You have no idea what you have just agreed to." Elena followed him in silence, the pup cradled tightly against her chest, its weak heartbeat a steady reminder of why she had made this choice. The forest around them seemed to shift and breathe with unseen life, shadows that moved with too much purpose to be simple tricks of the wind. She caught glimpses of eyes among the trees, pairs of them, gold and amber and pale blue, watching her pass with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "They are curious," Cade said without turning around, as though he had read her thoughts. "It has been a long time since a human walked these woods and lived to tell about it." "That should comfort me," she muttered under her breath, but somehow it did not. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was small but sturdy, built from thick logs that had clearly stood against decades of harsh winters. A single window glowed faintly with the memory of old firelight, and the door creaked open easily under Cade's hand, revealing a simple room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, and shelves lined with jars and cloth that looked like they had been untouched for years. "There are supplies here," Cade said, gesturing toward the shelves. "Bandages, herbs, things that might help. My pack has used this place before, though rarely for something like this." Elena moved quickly, laying the pup gently on a folded blanket near the hearth, before crouching to examine it properly for the first time in decent light. Its ribs showed sharply beneath thin fur, and there was a wound along its hind leg that looked like it had been caused by something sharp, maybe rocks along the creek bed. She worked with practiced hands, cleaning the injury as gently as she could, murmuring soft reassurances to the whimpering pup as she wrapped the wound in strips of clean cloth. Cade stood near the doorway, watching her work with an expression she could not quite place. There was something almost reluctant in the way he observed her, like a man forcing himself to remain detached from something he found impossible to ignore. "You are good at this," he said finally. "I volunteer at an animal shelter," she replied without looking up, focused entirely on the pup's shallow breathing. "I have seen worse than this. It will need warmth, fluids, and rest, but I think it will survive if someone keeps watch tonight." Cade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And you intend to be that someone?" Elena finally looked up at him, meeting those striking gold eyes without flinching. "Yes," she said simply. "I already told you. I am not leaving this pup to die." Something in his expression shifted again, that same flicker of surprise from before, though this time it lingered a little longer before he masked it. "Very well," he said. "You may stay until dawn. But understand this, Elena Marsh, and know that I do not offer such allowances lightly. My pack does not welcome outsiders, and the ones who linger too long in Blackthorn Ridge rarely find their way back to the world they came from unchanged." Elena felt a shiver run down her spine at his words, but she did not look away. "I am not afraid of you," she said, though her racing heart suggested otherwise. Cade's lips curved into something that was almost a smile, sharp and knowing. "Perhaps you should be," he said quietly, before turning and stepping back out into the night, leaving her alone with the small, fragile life she had chosen to save. Through the long hours that followed, Elena sat beside the pup, feeding it warm droplets of milk she found stored in the cabin, keeping the fire burning steady against the cold that pressed in from outside. Every so often she caught the sound of movement beyond the walls, soft footsteps in the underbrush, the occasional low growl carried on the wind. She knew, without needing to see them, that she was being watched all through the night, that the pack was circling the cabin, like sentries guarding something precious, or perhaps something dangerous. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, the pup's breathing had steadied, its tiny body warm and calm against her side. Elena allowed herself a small, exhausted smile, brushing a hand gently over its soft fur. "You made it through the night," she whispered. "That is the hardest part." The cabin door opened without warning, and Cade stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling to the pup resting peacefully by the fire. Something in his stern expression softened, just slightly, at the sight. "It lives," he said, more to himself than to her. "It does," Elena replied, rising carefully to her feet, her body aching from the long night, but her heart lighter than it had any right to be. "And I intend to make sure it stays that way." Cade's gaze lifted to meet hers, gold eyes searching her face, as though trying to solve a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. "You said you would leave at first light," he reminded her, though there was less certainty in his voice than there had been the night before. Elena glanced down at the sleeping pup, then back up at the alpha standing in the doorway, and felt something settle firmly in her chest, a decision made before she even realized she was making it. "I did say that," she agreed. But this pup still needs care for weeks, maybe longer, before it is strong enough to be on its own. If you truly want it to survive, you are going to need my help a little while longer." Cade's expression darkened, though not with anger, more like a man realizing he had walked directly into a trap of his own making. The silence between them stretched taut, filled with unspoken tension, until finally he spoke again, his voice low and edged with something Elena could not quite name. "You are either the bravest human I have ever met," he said, "or the most foolish." Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Maybe I am both," she said. Outside, the forest stirred with the first sounds of morning, birds calling from the treetops, wind rustling through ancient branches, and somewhere among the trees, unseen eyes continued to watch the cabin, where a human woman had chosen, against every warning and every instinct of survival, to stay in the one place she had been told never to return to. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment as dawn broke over Blackthorn Ridge, that this single choice would change everything the pack had ever believed about strength, about loyalty, and about the walls an alpha built around his own heart. But the pup sleeping peacefully by the fire was only the beginning. Others were coming, more lost and broken little lives that the pack itself had turned away, and Elena Marsh was about to discover that her refusal to reject even one of them would set her on a path far more dangerous and far more extraordinary than she ever could have imagined when her car first veered off that lonely road into the dark heart of the forest. Morning light filtered weakly through the trees as Elena stepped outside the cabin for the first time since the night before, stretching muscles stiff from sitting curled beside the fire. The pup, whom she had quietly started calling Rowan in her own mind, slept soundly on a nest of blankets near the hearth, its breathing finally even and unlabored. She allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, taking in the strange beauty of Blackthorn Ridge in daylight, the towering pines stretching toward a pale sky, dew clinging to every leaf like scattered glass. She had expected the forest to feel less menacing in the light of day. Instead, it felt almost sacred, ancient in a way that made her feel impossibly small and out of place. She understood now why the pack guarded this land so fiercely. It was not simply territory to them, it was home, in the truest sense of the word. Cade had not returned since dawn, and Elena found herself wondering, more than once, whether he regretted allowing her to stay even this long. She busied herself gathering water from the creek, boiling it over the fire, checking the pup's wound with careful fingers, to make sure no infection had taken hold overnight. The little creature stirred under her touch, opening one groggy eye, before nuzzling deeper into the blankets, with a soft, contented sound that made Elena's chest ache with something close to joy. By midday, she heard footsteps approaching the cabin, deliberate and unhurried, and she knew without looking up that it was Cade before he even stepped through the door. "How is it?" he asked, his gaze immediately drawn to the sleeping pup. "Stronger," Elena answered, glancing up at him. "It ate again an hour ago and kept it down. The wound looks clean. I think, with time, it will be just fine." Something in Cade's posture eased, just slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "You have kept your word so far," he said. "That is more than I expected from someone who wandered into my territory by accident." Elena tilted her head, studying him in the same careful way he seemed to study her. "You did not expect me to care for it properly," she said. "Or you did not expect me to stay at all." "Both," he admitted, and there was a rare honesty in the word that surprised her. She turned back to the pup, running a gentle hand along its side. "I told you last night," she said quietly. "I do not abandon things that need help. It is not in me to do that, no matter how frightening the circumstances might be." Cade watched her in silence for a long moment, and Elena felt the weight of his gaze like something physical, pressing against her skin. There was a wariness in him that ran deeper than simple caution about an outsider learning the secrets of his pack. It was something older, something guarded, far more carefully than any territorial boundary. "You should know," he said eventually, "that not everyone in my pack will welcome your presence here, however brief it may be. There are those who see any human intrusion as a threat that must be dealt with swiftly, regardless of circumstance." Elena felt a small flicker of unease at his words, though she refused to let it show. "Are you one of them?" she asked. Cade's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. I have not decided yet, he said, and something in his tone told her that was the most truthful answer he was willing to give. The days that followed fell into a strange, careful rhythm. Elena remained at the cabin, tending to the pup's recovery, watching its strength return day by day until it could finally stand on shaky legs and take a few wobbling steps across the wooden floor. She learned quickly that Cade visited each morning, always with the same quiet, measured presence, always studying her as much as he studied the pup's progress, though he rarely spoke more than a few words during each visit. She also learned that she was never truly alone in the forest surrounding the cabin. Shapes moved among the trees at the edges of her vision, some on 4 legs, some walking upright like Cade had that first night, all of them watching, assessing, though none approached close enough for her to see clearly. It should have terrified her. Instead, after the first few days, she found herself growing almost used to the sensation, the way a person might grow used to living beside the ocean, aware of its vast power, but no longer frightened by its presence. On the 4th evening, as the sun began sinking low behind the tree line, Elena heard something different in the sounds surrounding the cabin, a rustle of movement that carried an urgency the previous nights had lacked. She stepped outside cautiously, the recovering pup trailing weakly at her heels, and found a young wolf standing at the edge of the clearing, its silver fur catching the last light of day. In its jaws, held with impossible gentleness, was a second pup, smaller than the first had been, its tiny body limp and still. Elena's heart lurched painfully in her chest. She approached slowly, careful not to startle the silver wolf, murmuring soft words of reassurance the way she might to a frightened animal at the shelter back home. The wolf did not run. Instead, it lowered its head and placed the small bundle gently on the ground before her, then stepped back, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. Elena knelt immediately, checking the pup with trembling hands. It was breathing, barely, its tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven movements. Unlike the first pup, this one showed no visible wounds, no obvious injury, but its fur was dull, its little body thin, in a way that spoke of neglect rather than accident. "What happened to you?" she whispered, gathering the fragile creature into her arms and hurrying back toward the warmth of the cabin. The silver wolf followed at a cautious distance, pausing at the tree line as though unsure whether it was permitted to come any closer. Elena glanced back once, meeting the animal's watchful gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding that needed no words. Inside she worked quickly, warming milk over the fire, wrapping the pup in soft cloth, checking for any sign of illness or injury she might have missed. It took nearly an hour before the little creature finally responded, taking a weak sip of warmed milk from the small dish she held to its mouth, its tiny tail giving the faintest, most exhausted wag. Cade arrived not long after, his expression tightening the moment he saw the second pup nestled beside the first near the hearth. "This one was rejected by its mother," he said quietly, kneeling beside Elena to examine the small creature himself. "It happens sometimes, when a litter is too large or when the mother senses weakness she cannot afford to nurture. It is the way of the pack, difficult as it may be to witness." Elena felt something sharp and defensive rise in her chest at his words. "So it was simply going to be left to die?" she asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. Cade's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker behind his golden eyes, something that looked almost like old pain carefully buried beneath years of practiced control. "It is not a decision made from cruelty," he said. "It is instinct, survival, a hard truth of life in the wild. Not every creature born into this world is meant to continue in it." "I do not accept that," Elena said firmly, cradling the small pup a little closer against her chest. "Every creature deserves a chance, no matter how difficult its beginning might be. I did not travel to this forest to watch something be given up on, simply because it was inconvenient to keep alive." Silence settled between them, heavy and charged. Cade studied her for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were weighing words he had not expected to need. Finally he spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You remind me of someone who does not exist within these woods any longer," he said, so softly Elena almost missed it entirely. "A kindness that this pack once knew, and lost, a very long time ago." Before she could ask what he meant, he rose to his feet, his expression closing off once more, into the guarded composure she had grown familiar with over the past several days. "I will speak with the young wolf who brought the pup to you," he said. "Her name is Ivy. She is young, still learning her place within the pack, and clearly saw something in you that made her trust you with what she could not save herself." Elena glanced toward the doorway, where she could just make out the shape of the silver wolf, still waiting patiently at the edge of the clearing. She trusted her instincts, Elena said. That is more than some grown wolves seem willing to do. Cade's lips curved faintly at that, the closest thing to real amusement she had seen from him since their first encounter. "Careful, Elena Marsh," he said. "You are beginning to sound like you understand my pack better than some of its own members." "Maybe I am simply better at recognizing when something needs help," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, regardless of what species it happens to be. Cade held her gaze a moment longer before turning toward the door, pausing just before he stepped outside into the gathering dusk. "You may keep this second pup as well," he said, "for now. But understand, Elena, 2 abandoned pups sheltered by a human within my territory will not go unnoticed by the rest of the pack. Word will spread quickly. Not everyone will approve of what is happening within these walls." "Let them disapprove," Elena said, glancing down at the 2 small, fragile lives now resting safely beside her fire. "I did not come here looking for approval. I came here because something needed help, and I refuse to walk away from that, no matter how many more nights I am allowed to stay." Cade said nothing more, simply nodding once, before disappearing into the darkening trees, leaving Elena alone once again, with the growing responsibility she had never planned to take on, yet somehow could not imagine turning away from. Outside, Ivy the silver wolf remained at the edge of the clearing a while longer, watching the warm glow of firelight through the cabin window, before finally slipping back into the shadows of the forest. Elena did not know it yet, but word of what had happened that evening was already beginning to travel through Blackthorn Ridge, carried from wolf to wolf beneath the rising moon, the story of a human woman who refused to let even the most fragile, forgotten lives be left behind. It was only the second pup, but deep in her heart, Elena already understood that it would not be the last. Word of the 2 pups sheltered inside the cabin spread through Blackthorn Ridge faster than Elena could have imagined. By the 5th morning of her stay, she noticed more shapes gathering at the edges of the clearing, wolves of every size and color, some watching with open curiosity, others with expressions that even in their animal forms seemed unmistakably suspicious. She tried not to let it unsettle her as she went about her daily routine, feeding the pups, changing their bedding, checking their wounds, but the growing audience made it difficult to ignore the sense that she was being tested by an entire community, not just its leader. Cade continued his morning visits, though his manner had shifted subtly since the arrival of the second pup. He seemed more watchful now, more careful in the words he chose, as though he too understood that eyes beyond his own were paying close attention to how this strange arrangement unfolded. "The pack is talking," he told her one morning, standing near the cabin door while Elena knelt by the fire, coaxing the smaller pup to drink from a small dish of warmed milk. "Some believe I have made a grave error in allowing you to remain here this long." Elena did not look up right away, focused on the pup's weak, determined attempts to lap at the milk. "And what do you believe?" she asked quietly. Cade was silent for a long moment. "I believe," he said finally, "that I have never seen anyone care for creatures that are not their own, with the kind of devotion you have shown these past several days. Whether that makes you dangerous or simply unusual, I have not yet decided." Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I will take unusual," she said. "It sounds better than dangerous." For a moment, something almost like warmth flickered across Cade's expression, quickly hidden away again, beneath the composed mask he seemed to wear at all times. He crossed the room and crouched beside her, studying the 2 pups with an intensity that suggested he was searching for something he could not quite name. "The larger one," he said, gesturing toward the first pup, "has grown remarkably strong in a short time. He will make a fine addition to the pack once he is old enough to run with the others." "And the smaller one?" Elena asked, glancing toward the second pup still nestled weakly in its blankets. Cade's expression grew more guarded. "She is fragile," he admitted. "It is possible she may not survive, even with your care. Some creatures are simply born weaker than others, through no fault of their own." Elena felt a familiar surge of stubborn determination rise within her chest. "She will survive," she said firmly. I refuse to accept anything less. Cade studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. You speak with such certainty, he said, as though sheer will alone can rewrite the outcome nature has already decided. Sometimes it can, Elena replied. I have seen it happen before. Animals given up on by everyone around them. Animals that everyone assumed would not make it through the week, who went on to live long, full lives simply because someone refused to stop trying. Cade did not respond immediately, though Elena noticed the way his gaze lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary, before he finally rose to his feet and stepped back toward the door. I hope, for both our sakes, that you are right, he said quietly, before disappearing once more into the surrounding trees. That afternoon, as Elena sat outside the cabin, cleaning bandages in the pale autumn sunlight, she noticed a tall, broad-shouldered man approaching from the tree line, his expression carrying none of the careful neutrality Cade so often wore. His dark hair was cropped close, his stance rigid with barely restrained tension, and Elena felt her pulse quicken as he drew closer, stopping just a few feet away with his arms crossed firmly over his chest. You must be the human causing all the commotion, he said, his voice sharp with disapproval. Elena straightened slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching, though her heart hammered nervously against her ribs. I suppose I am, she said evenly, and you are. Rourke, he said curtly. Beta of this pack, and the one tasked with keeping order when our alpha's judgment becomes clouded by matters he should not be entertaining. Elena raised an eyebrow at the pointed insinuation in his words. I am simply caring for 2 abandoned pups, she said. I am not sure how that threatens the order of your pack. Rourke's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking briefly toward the cabin before returning to her face. It is not the pups that concern me, he said. It is the precedent you are setting, and the influence you are beginning to hold over our alpha. Cade Ashgrove did not build this pack into what it is today, by allowing outsiders to soften his judgment. I have no interest in changing anyone's judgment, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small flicker of uncertainty creep into her chest. I only want to help these pups survive. That is all. Rourke studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his expression unreadable. Perhaps that is true, he said finally, but intentions rarely matter as much as consequences, and you would do well to remember that before you grow too comfortable within these woods. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode back toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows, with the same silent grace Elena had come to associate with every member of this pack. She stood alone in the clearing for several long minutes afterward, his warning echoing uncomfortably in her mind, before finally forcing herself back inside to check on the pups. That evening, as darkness settled fully over Blackthorn Ridge, Elena heard a soft scratching at the cabin door, different from the confident, deliberate footsteps she had come to associate with Cade's visits. She opened the door cautiously and found Ivy, the young silver wolf who had brought the second pup to her days earlier, standing alone in the moonlight, her ears pinned back nervously against her head. Hello again, Elena said softly, kneeling to meet the wolf's cautious gaze. Did you come to check on your friend? Ivy took a hesitant step forward, glancing toward the warm glow of the fire visible through the open door, before shifting her weight uncertainly. Elena stepped aside, allowing the young wolf to slip past her into the cabin, watching as Ivy padded quietly toward the sleeping pups and settled down beside them with a soft, contented sigh, her body curling protectively around the 2 small forms. Elena smiled, closing the door gently against the cold night air. You care about them too, she said quietly, settling down nearby, even though you could not save them yourself. Ivy's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, though the young wolf did not lift her head from where it rested near the pups. Elena understood, in that quiet moment, that this was not so different from the shelters she had worked in back home, where sometimes the kindest thing an animal could do was simply recognize that another needed help, even when it could not provide that help alone. Over the following days, Ivy became a frequent visitor, arriving each evening to curl up beside the pups while Elena worked, occasionally shifting into her human form for brief periods, though she remained shy and quiet, offering only soft, careful words before retreating back into silence. Elena learned that Ivy was young, barely more than a teenager by human standards, and that she had lost her own mother during a harsh winter several years earlier. raised since then by the collective care of the pack rather than any single guardian. "That is why you brought her to me," Elena said one evening, watching as Ivy gently nuzzled the smaller pup, who had grown noticeably stronger over the past week. "You knew what it felt like to be without someone who could care for you the way you needed." Ivy's human form, still awkward and uncertain in the way she carried herself, nodded slowly. "I did not want her to feel that too," she said quietly. "Even if I could not have prevented it myself." Elena reached out and gently squeezed the younger woman's hand, feeling a swell of warmth and gratitude that went beyond mere gratitude for the trust she had been shown. "You did more than you realize," Elena said. "You gave her a chance, and that chance is exactly what saved her." As the days continued to pass, Elena noticed the pups growing stronger by the hour, their eyes brighter, their movements more coordinated, their small bodies filling out with the steady nourishment and care she provided. The larger pup, whom she had quietly begun calling Rowan despite never speaking the name aloud to anyone else, had taken to following her around the cabin on unsteady legs, tumbling over his own paws in a way that never failed to bring a smile to her tired face. The smaller pup, still fragile but improving daily, had begun to open her eyes fully for the first time, revealing a pair of striking amber irises that reminded Elena so much of the forest itself that she found herself calling the little one Autumn, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. Cade's visits continued each morning, though Elena noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor as the days went on, a loosening of the careful distance he had maintained since their first encounter. He began staying longer, sometimes simply sitting nearby while she worked, watching the pups with an expression that had softened considerably from the guarded wariness of their earliest meetings. "You have done what many within my own pack believed impossible," he said one morning, watching as Autumn wobbled unsteadily across the wooden floor toward her waiting hands. "Both of these pups should have been lost. Instead, they thrive." Elena glanced up at him, catching the rare openness in his expression, before he could mask it away again. "It was not just me," she said. "Ivy helped as much as I did. She trusted her instincts, even when everyone else around her had already given up." Cade's gaze flickered briefly toward the door, where Ivy's silver form could be glimpsed resting just outside in the afternoon sun. "She has always had a gentle heart," he admitted. "Perhaps gentler than this pack has always known how to properly value." There was something in his tone that caught Elena's attention, a weight beneath the words that suggested old wounds she had not yet begun to understand. Before she could ask about it, however, a sudden commotion erupted outside the cabin, raised voices carrying urgently through the trees, and Cade's entire posture shifted instantly from relaxed observation to sharp, alert readiness. "Stay here," he said firmly, already moving toward the door. Elena's heart pounded as she watched him disappear into the trees, the sound of voices growing louder and more agitated in the distance. She gathered the two pups close, unwilling to leave them unprotected, and waited anxiously by the fire, straining to make sense of the commotion unfolding somewhere beyond her sight. Minutes passed like hours before Cade finally returned, his expression tight with barely restrained frustration, a group of pack members trailing behind him at a respectful distance. Among them, Elena spotted Rourke, his expression carrying the same disapproval she had witnessed during their earlier confrontation, along with several other wolves in human form, whose faces ranged from curious to openly hostile. "What happened?" Elena asked, rising to her feet with the pup still cradled protectively in her arms. Cade's jaw tightened before he answered. "A dispute," he said carefully, "regarding the decisions I have made these past several days. Some within my pack believe I have allowed a human far too much freedom within our territory, and they have gathered to voice that concern directly." Elena's stomach twisted with unease as she glanced past him, toward the gathered wolves, several of whom watched her with expressions that made her skin prickle uncomfortably. "And what did you tell them?" she asked quietly. Cade's gaze held hers steadily, something resolute settling into his features that had not been there before. "I told them," he said, "that the decisions made within this territory remain mine to make, and that the survival of two pups who would otherwise have perished speaks for itself, far louder than any complaint raised against the woman who saved them." A murmur rippled through the gathered pack members at his words, some expressions shifting toward grudging acceptance, others remaining stubbornly resistant. Rourke, in particular, held Elena's gaze for a long moment before finally turning away, his expression unreadable, but far from satisfied. "This is far from settled," he said quietly, before disappearing back into the trees, several other wolves following close behind him. Elena watched them go, her heart still racing from the tension of the confrontation, before turning back to Cade, who remained standing near the doorway, his expression heavy with thoughts he had not yet chosen to share. "Thank you," she said softly, "for defending us." Cade's gaze softened slightly, as it settled on the two pups still nestled in her arms. "I did not do it entirely for you," he admitted. "These pups belong to my pack, regardless of who has cared for them these past several days. But I will not pretend that your dedication to their survival has not changed something in how I view what is possible within these woods." Elena felt an unexpected warmth bloom in her chest at his words, though she quickly pushed the feeling aside, uncertain what to make of it. As dusk settled fully over Blackthorn Ridge that evening, casting long shadows across the clearing surrounding the cabin, Elena found herself wondering just how much longer this fragile arrangement could hold, and what exactly it would take to shatter it completely. She did not have to wonder for long, because deep in the darkest corner of the forest, far beyond the reach of firelight and the watchful protection of the pack, a third small life was already fighting for survival, one that would soon find its way to her door, and with it, bring a challenge to pack law far greater than anything Elena had yet faced. The days following the confrontation in the clearing brought a strange, uneasy calm to Blackthorn Ridge. Elena continued her routine with the two pups, feeding them, watching them grow stronger, marveling at how quickly Rowan had begun to explore beyond the cabin's threshold on increasingly steady legs, while Autumn, though still smaller and more delicate, had finally begun to match her brother's playful energy in short, joyful bursts. Yet beneath the surface of that calm, Elena could feel the tension that lingered from Rourke's warning. She noticed it in the way certain pack members watched her from the tree line with narrowed eyes, in the hushed conversations that fell silent whenever she drew near, in the careful distance Cade seemed to maintain during his morning visits, as though he too sensed the fragile nature of the peace they had built. "You seem troubled," Elena said one morning, watching as Cade sat near the fire, his gaze distant and unfocused, as Rowan tumbled playfully around his boots. Cade blinked, seeming to pull himself back from wherever his thoughts had wandered. "It is nothing you need concern yourself with," he said, though the tightness in his voice suggested otherwise. Elena set down the cloth she had been using to clean Autumn's bedding and settled onto the floor across from him, studying his face carefully. "You defended me in front of your entire pack," she said. "I think that makes it something I should concern myself with." Cade's gaze finally met hers, and for a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her with an expression that seemed to war between wariness and something far gentler underneath. "Rourke is not wrong to raise his concerns," he admitted finally. "My pack has survived for generations by maintaining strict boundaries between our world and the human world beyond these woods. What you have witnessed here, what you now know about us, represents a risk that many believe should never have been permitted to exist." Elena felt a small chill at his words, though she kept her expression steady. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Allowing me to stay?" Cade was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the two pups now curled together near the fire, sleeping peacefully in a tangle of fur and warmth. "No," he said finally, so quietly she almost missed it. "Whatever risk your presence here represents, I cannot bring myself to regret what it has meant for these two lives. That surprises me more than I care to admit." Something warm and fragile bloomed in Elena's chest at his words, though she quickly reminded herself of the precariousness of her situation. A human woman living on the edge of a world that was not her own, tolerated but not fully accepted, useful but never entirely trusted. She pushed the feeling aside and focused instead on the practical matters at hand. "How much longer," she asked, "do you think the pack will allow this arrangement to continue?" Cade's expression grew more serious. "That depends," he said, "on how the pups continue to progress, and on whether any further incidents arise that might tip opinion further against you. I will not lie to you, Elena. There are those within my pack who would prefer you gone entirely, regardless of the good you have done here." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words. "Then I suppose I simply need to keep proving them wrong," she said, with more confidence than she truly felt. Cade's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, the first genuine one she had seen from him in several days. "Perhaps you already have," he said. "More than you realize. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the tree line and shadows stretched long across the clearing, Elena heard something different carried on the evening breeze, a distant howl that sent a shiver down her spine, low and mournful, unlike any sound she had heard from the pack before. She stepped outside cautiously, scanning the darkening trees, and found Ivy standing at the edge of the clearing once more, though this time the young wolf's posture carried a tension that immediately set Elena on edge.
"What is it?"
Elena asked, hurrying toward her.
"What happened?"
Ivy shifted quickly into her human form, her expression pale and urgent. "There is another pup," she said breathlessly. "Abandoned near the old ravine, 3 days without its mother. I found it while patrolling the eastern boundary. I did not know what else to do." Elena's heart clenched painfully. "Show me," she said immediately, already reaching for her jacket. "It is too dangerous," Ivy protested. "The ravine is far from here, and night is falling quickly. Cade would not want you traveling that distance without protection." "Then find him," Elena said firmly. "But I am not letting another pup suffer alone in the dark simply because the timing is inconvenient. Every minute we waste arguing is a minute that pup does not have to spare." Ivy hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, turning to disappear swiftly into the trees, her silver form vanishing into the gathering dusk. Elena gathered a warm blanket and a small satchel of supplies, casting one last glance toward the sleeping pups by the fire, before securing the cabin door and setting off into the forest, following the general direction Ivy had indicated, with a fierce determination that outweighed the fear, coiling tightly in her stomach. She had not traveled far before she heard the sound of rapid footsteps approaching from behind, and turned to find Cade closing the distance between them, with long, urgent strides, his expression carrying a mixture of frustration and something that looked almost like reluctant admiration. "You should not be out here alone," he said, falling into step beside her without slowing his pace. "I was not planning to wait for permission," Elena replied, matching his urgency despite the burning in her legs from the uneven forest terrain. "There is a pup out there that needs help. I could not simply sit by the fire and hope someone else would handle it in time." Cade's jaw tightened, though there was no real anger in his expression, more a kind of exasperated understanding that Elena was beginning to recognize as uniquely hers to inspire in him. "You are going to be the death of my careful reputation," he muttered, though the words carried no real bite. They pressed onward through the darkening woods, guided by Ivy's occasional howls marking the path ahead, until the trees finally opened onto the edge of a steep ravine, the ground falling away sharply into shadow below. Ivy waited near the edge, her silver form pacing anxiously, and as Elena drew closer she heard it, a faint, weak whimpering rising from somewhere down in the darkness. "There," Ivy said, pointing with her nose toward a narrow ledge partway down the ravine's rocky face. "It has been stuck there for hours. I could not reach it safely on my own." Elena's stomach dropped as she peered over the edge, spotting the small, trembling shape huddled on the narrow outcrop, separated from the top by several meters of steep, crumbling rock. Cade moved quickly to her side, his expression tightening with concern as he assessed the treacherous descent. "I will go," he said firmly. "It is too dangerous for you to attempt this climb." Elena shook her head immediately. "You are too large to fit safely on that ledge," she argued. "If the rock gives way beneath your weight, you could bring the whole shelf down with you, and the pup along with it. I am lighter. I have more control." Cade's expression darkened with obvious reluctance, but he seemed to recognize the truth in her words even as every instinct within him rebelled against the idea of allowing her to take such a risk. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of raw concern that made her chest ache unexpectedly. "If anything happens to you, I will be careful," she promised, already securing the blanket around her shoulders and testing the first foothold along the rocky descent. "Just stay close, in case I need help pulling us back up." The climb down was harrowing, loose stones skittering away beneath her feet, the darkness making it difficult to judge distances accurately, her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain it could be heard echoing through the entire ravine. But finally, after what felt like an eternity of careful, deliberate movement, she reached the narrow ledge and gathered the trembling pup gently into her arms, wrapping it securely within the folds of the blanket against her chest. "I have got you," she whispered softly, feeling the pup's frantic heartbeat gradually begin to slow beneath her steady, reassuring touch. You are safe now. The climb back up proved even more difficult, one arm occupied with cradling the precious bundle against her chest, but Cade's steady voice guided her from above, calling out careful instructions, his golden eyes never leaving her form as she navigated the treacherous rock face, inch by careful inch. When she finally reached the top, his hands closed firmly around her arms, pulling her the last few feet to solid ground, with a strength that left no doubt about the raw power contained within his human form. For a long moment, they simply stood there, Elena breathless and trembling from adrenaline, the rescued pup clutched safely against her chest, Cade's hands still gripping her arms, as though he could not quite bring himself to let go. His gaze searched her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. That was reckless, he said quietly, though his voice carried no real anger, only something far more complicated underneath. I know, Elena admitted, still catching her breath. But it worked. Cade's expression shifted, something raw and unguarded flickering across his features before he carefully composed himself once more, releasing her arms and stepping back with visible effort. It did, he agreed softly. Because of you. The walk back to the cabin passed in comfortable silence, Ivy trotting contentedly alongside them, the newly rescued pup finally settling into a peaceful sleep against Elena's chest by the time they reached the familiar warmth of the fire. As Elena settled the third small life alongside its sleeping companions, she felt a quiet, steady certainty settle over her, the growing understanding that whatever path had led her into this strange, dangerous forest, it was one she no longer wished to walk away from, no matter what challenges still waited ahead. 3 now, she murmured, watching the little ones sleep soundly together for the first time. Cade, standing quietly near the doorway, allowed himself a small, genuine smile. 3, he agreed, and I suspect, somehow, that will not be the last number either of us hears before this is through. He was right, because word of the daring rescue at the ravine spread through Blackthorn Ridge even faster than the news of the first 2 pups had, and among those who heard the story, opinions about the human woman sheltering the pack's forgotten young began to shift in ways neither Elena nor Cade could have fully predicted. Autumn came to Blackthorn Ridge in earnest over the following weeks, painting the towering pines in shades of amber and gold, the air growing crisper with each passing day. Elena had lost count of exactly how long she had remained within the forest, the days blending together in a steady rhythm of feeding, tending, and caring for the 3 pups who had become the center of her entire world. Rowan had grown into a confident, curious young pup, his dark fur thickening as he explored every corner of the clearing with boundless energy. Autumn remained smaller than her brother, but had developed a quiet resilience that Elena found deeply moving, watching the once fragile creature grow steadier and stronger with each passing week. The 3rd pup, whom Elena had taken to calling Birch for the way his fur caught the light like polished bark, had settled comfortably into the small, makeshift family, following the other 2 everywhere with an eager, easy loyalty. Cade's visits had become a fixture of her days, no longer simply obligatory check-ins, but genuine moments of conversation and quiet companionship that Elena found herself looking forward to more than she cared to admit. He spoke more freely now, sharing small pieces of his history, the weight of leadership he carried, the responsibilities that came with maintaining order across a pack as large and complex as Blackthorn Ridge. In turn, Elena found herself opening up about her own life beyond the forest, her work with the shelter, her belief that every creature, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, deserved a chance at survival. It was on a cool morning in late autumn that everything shifted once again. Elena had been outside gathering firewood when she heard raised voices carrying urgently from deeper within the pack's territory, a commotion far more significant than the quiet disagreements she had grown accustomed to overhearing. She hurried toward the sound, her heart pounding with a familiar sense of dread, and arrived at the edge of a wide clearing where a large gathering of pack members had assembled, their attention fixed on something at the center of the group that Elena could not immediately see. Cade stood near the front of the gathering, his expression carved from stone, and beside him stood an older woman, Elena recognized as one of the pack's senior members, someone she had seen occasionally at a distance but never spoken with directly. The woman held something small and still in her arms, and as Elena pushed closer through the crowd, ignoring the uneasy glances several pack members cast her way, she finally saw what had drawn everyone's attention. A newborn pup, barely hours old, lay motionless in the elder's arms, its tiny body marked by an obvious deformity along its hind legs, limbs that curled inward at an unnatural angle that would clearly prevent it from ever running or hunting the way a healthy pup would. The little creature's chest rose and fell in weak, shallow breaths, its eyes not yet open, utterly helpless and unaware of the fate being decided around it. "What is happening?" Elena asked, though some deep, instinctive part of her already understood, and the understanding filled her with a cold, creeping dread. The elder woman's gaze flicked toward her with obvious disapproval before returning to Cade. "This is not a matter for outsiders," she said sharply. "This is pack law, older than any of us standing here, and it does not bend for sentiment." Elena felt her stomach twist painfully. "What law?" she demanded, though her voice trembled slightly, despite her best efforts to remain steady. It was Cade who finally answered, his voice heavy with a burden Elena had never heard from him before. "A pup born with such a severe deformity cannot survive in the wild," he said quietly. "It could never run with the pack, never hunt, never defend itself against the dangers this forest presents. Pack law dictates that such pups are not permitted to linger in suffering. It is considered a mercy, however difficult that mercy might be to witness." Elena's blood ran cold, as the full weight of what was about to happen settled over her. "You mean to kill it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though the words seemed to echo loudly across the silent clearing. "We mean to spare it a lifetime of suffering it could never survive," the elder woman corrected sharply. "This is not cruelty, human. This is how our kind has endured for centuries. Every pack that has grown weak by clinging to sentiment over survival has eventually crumbled entirely." Elena's gaze dropped to the tiny, helpless creature in the elder's arms, its weak breath still rising and falling, utterly unaware of the debate raging over its fragile life. Something fierce and unshakable rose within her chest, the same certainty that had driven her to scoop up Rowan from beside that frozen creek weeks earlier, the same conviction that had sent her scrambling down a treacherous ravine in the dark to save Birch. "Give her to me," Elena said, stepping forward before she could fully think through the consequences of her own words. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the gathered pack, and the elder woman's eyes narrowed sharply. "This is not your decision to make," she said coldly. "This pup belongs to this pack, and pack law will be followed, regardless of what a human woman believes is right or wrong." Elena's gaze shifted to Cade, searching his face desperately for some sign of support, some indication that he might stand beside her the way he had during the confrontation weeks earlier. But his expression remained tight and unreadable, torn between conflicting loyalties that Elena could see warring visibly behind his golden eyes. "Cade," she said softly, "please, look at her. She is alive right now. She is fighting to breathe, fighting to survive, and no one has even given her the chance to try." The clearing fell into tense, heavy silence, every pair of eyes shifting between Elena and their alpha, waiting to see which way the fragile balance would finally tip. Cade's jaw worked silently for a long moment, the weight of generations of tradition pressing against something newer, something that had grown quietly within him over the past several weeks, since Elena had first wandered into his territory. "This law exists for good reason," he said finally, though his voice carried none of the certainty it usually held. "It has protected this pack from generations of unnecessary suffering. And how many of those pups," Elena pressed, her voice trembling with barely restrained emotion, "might have surprised everyone, the way Rowan and Autumn and Birch have, if someone had simply given them the chance you are refusing to give her now." Cade's gaze dropped to the pup cradled in the elder's arms, something shifting visibly behind his controlled expression. The elder woman, sensing the tide beginning to turn, stepped forward with renewed urgency. "Alpha," she said sharply, "you cannot allow personal sentiment to override centuries of established law. If you make this exception, others will follow. The very foundation of order within this pack will begin to crumble." "Then let it crumble," Elena said fiercely, before Cade could respond, "and I will be the one who prompted its fall, if that is what saving one innocent life costs. But I refuse to stand here and watch a helpless creature be given up on before it has even opened its eyes, simply because tradition says it must be so." The clearing fell utterly silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the crisp autumn air. Cade's gaze finally lifted to meet hers, and Elena saw something raw and conflicted burning behind his golden eyes, the visible struggle of a man, torn between the world he had inherited and the possibility of something entirely new. "Give her to Elena," he said finally, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority that immediately silenced the murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd. The elder woman's expression hardened with obvious disapproval, but she did not argue further, stepping forward instead to place the tiny, fragile pup carefully into Elena's waiting arms. Elena's breath caught as she felt the impossibly light weight of the small creature settle against her chest, its weak heartbeat fluttering rapidly beneath her steady palm. "If this pup survives," the elder woman said coldly, addressing Cade directly rather than Elena, "it changes nothing about the challenges she will face for the rest of her life. She will never run with the pack, she will never hunt, she will remain a burden that others must carry, for however long her life happens to last. Then we will carry that burden together," Elena said firmly, before Cade could respond, cradling the tiny pup protectively against her chest. "Because every life deserves the chance to prove what it is capable of, regardless of the limitations others assume it carries." The elder woman held Elena's gaze for a long, tense moment, before finally turning away, disappearing into the surrounding trees, with several other disapproving pack members trailing behind her. The rest of the gathering slowly dispersed as well, until only Cade remained standing beside Elena, in the now quiet clearing, his expression heavy with the weight of the decision he had just made. "You have no idea what you have just done," he said quietly, though there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of exhausted uncertainty. "I know exactly what I have done," Elena replied, glancing down at the tiny pup now resting peacefully in her arms, her weak breaths finally beginning to steady. "I saved a life that deserved the chance to be saved." Cade studied her for a long moment, something complicated and unspoken passing behind his gaze. "You have also challenged centuries of tradition within my pack," he said. "There will be consequences, Elena. Rourke and the elders will not simply let this pass without further resistance." Elena met his gaze steadily, despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach at his words. "Then we will face those consequences when they come," she said. "But I will not regret this decision, no matter what challenges follow." Cade's expression softened slightly, something warm and unguarded flickering briefly across his features, before he carefully composed himself once more. "Neither will I," he admitted quietly, reaching out to gently brush a careful finger along the tiny pup's soft, downy fur. "Whatever this costs us, Elena, I find that I cannot regret it either." Together they walked back toward the cabin in comforting silence. The fourth small life now settled securely within the growing family Elena had built, despite every warning and every obstacle placed in her path. She named the little pup Wren that evening, watching as Rowan, Autumn, and Birch gathered curiously around their newest companion, sniffing carefully at the fragile newcomer, before settling down protectively around her small, sleeping form. "Four now," Elena murmured that night, watching the pups sleep peacefully together by the warm glow of the fire. But even as she allowed herself a small moment of quiet contentment, she could not shake the unease that lingered in the pit of her stomach, the certainty that the elder woman's warning had not been an empty threat, and that somewhere within the shadows of Blackthorn Ridge, resistance to the changes she had brought into this ancient forest was only beginning to gather its full and dangerous strength. In the days following Wren's rescue, Elena noticed a distinct shift in the atmosphere surrounding the cabin. Some pack members, particularly the younger ones, began approaching with quiet curiosity, occasionally leaving small offerings of food near the doorway, fresh-caught fish or berries gathered from deeper in the woods, silent gestures of acceptance that Elena treasured more than words could have expressed. Others, however, remained distant and wary, casting suspicious glances whenever she ventured beyond the safety of the clearing, their disapproval simmering just beneath the surface of forced civility. Wren's recovery proved slower and more delicate than the other pups had experienced, her twisted hind legs requiring careful, patient therapy that Elena researched through half-remembered lessons from her years at the shelter, gently massaging the tiny limbs each day, encouraging small, deliberate movements that might one day allow the pup some measure of mobility, even if she would never run the way her siblings eventually would. Cade visited more frequently now, often staying well into the evening, watching as Elena worked patiently with Wren, occasionally offering quiet observations, or simply sitting in comfortable silence as the fire crackled softly beside them. Elena had noticed, though she tried not to dwell on it too deeply, the way his gaze lingered on her when he believed she was too absorbed in her work to notice. The careful, searching quality that suggested thoughts he had not yet found the courage to voice. "You do not have to stay every evening," she told him one night, though there was no real complaint in her words, only quiet curiosity about what drew him back so consistently. Cade's gaze lifted from where Wren lay curled contentedly in his large hands, her twisted legs finally showing the faintest signs of increased flexibility after days of careful therapy. "I know," he said simply. "I choose to." Something warm bloomed in Elena's chest at the quiet admission, though she quickly focused her attention back on preparing the evening meal for the pups, unwilling to examine too closely the feelings that had been steadily growing within her over the past weeks. "Why?" she asked softly, unable to fully resist the question. Cade was silent for a long moment, his fingers gently stroking along Wren's soft fur as the little pup let out a contented, sleepy sigh. "Because within these walls," he said finally, "I have witnessed something I did not believe still existed within Blackthorn Ridge, a kindness unburdened by fear or tradition, offered simply because it is right, regardless of the cost it might carry." Elena's breath caught softly at the raw honesty in his words. "That sounds like a heavy thing to have been missing," she said quietly. "It was," Cade admitted, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers, golden eyes carrying a weight of vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed from him before. "I was not always the alpha you see before you now, Elena. I earned this position through strength and sacrifice, through proving myself worthy, in ways that left little room for softness or mercy. I had forgotten, I think, what it felt like to witness compassion offered so freely, without calculation or expectation of return." Elena set aside the small dish she had been preparing and moved to sit beside him near the fire, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "What happened to you?" she asked gently, sensing that beneath his careful composure lay a story he had never shared with anyone else within his pack. Cade's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not pull away from the quiet intimacy of the moment. "I was born the runt of my own litter," he said finally, so quietly Elena almost missed the words entirely. "Weaker than my siblings, smaller, slower to develop the strength expected of a future alpha's bloodline. By the old laws that governed this pack at the time, I should have faced the very fate we spared Wren from just days ago." Elena's heart clenched painfully at the revelation, understanding now with sudden, painful clarity why his defense of the small pup's life had carried such raw, personal weight. "What happened?" she asked softly. "How did you survive?" "My mother refused to let the elders carry out the tradition," Cade continued, his gaze distant as he recalled memories clearly still painful even after so many years. "She hid me, cared for me in secret, until I grew strong enough that my survival could no longer be denied or reversed. She paid dearly for that defiance, cast out from her position of respect within the pack, forced to raise me largely alone, facing the same disapproval and suspicion you have faced these past several weeks." Elena reached out instinctively, resting a gentle hand against his arm, feeling the tension coiled tightly beneath his skin. "She saved you," Elena said softly. "Just like I saved Wren." Cade's gaze met hers, something raw and unguarded flickering behind his golden eyes. "Yes," he agreed quietly, "and it took me clawing my way through every trial this pack could devise, proving my strength and worth again and again, before I finally earned the respect that led me to become alpha. My mother did not live to see it. She passed before I claimed this position, never knowing that her defiance of tradition had ultimately shaped this pack's future leader." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, moved deeply by the quiet tragedy and triumph woven through his words. "She would be proud of you," Elena said softly. "Not just for becoming alpha, but for choosing today to be the kind of leader who saves lives, instead of simply following tradition blindly." Cade's expression softened further, something achingly vulnerable settling into his features as he studied her face in the warm firelight. "I could not have made that choice today," he admitted quietly, "without your influence pushing me to remember what I had nearly lost sight of entirely. You remind me, Elena, of the very qualities that saved my own life all those years ago." The air between them grew charged with an unspoken tension that Elena felt reflected deep within her own chest, a connection that had been steadily building since that very first night beside the frozen creek, when a wolf with golden eyes had watched her cradle a dying pup and chosen not to turn her away. "I am glad I could help you remember," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Cade's hand shifted slightly, his fingers brushing gently against hers where they rested near Wren's sleeping form, the touch tentative, yet carrying an unmistakable warmth that sent a soft shiver through Elena's entire body. "Elena," he said quietly, and there was something different in the way he spoke her name now, something that carried far more weight than simple gratitude or professional courtesy. "Yes," she whispered, hardly daring to breathe. "Whatever consequences follow from the choices we have made these past weeks," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers, "I find that I no longer regret a single one of them. Not the pups you have saved, not the traditions we have challenged, and certainly not the presence of the woman who wandered into my territory and refused to leave without a fight." Elena's heart pounded rapidly in her chest, warmth spreading through her at the quiet sincerity in his words. "Neither do I," she admitted softly. For a long moment, they simply sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling gently beside them, the 4 sleeping pups nestled peacefully nearby, the weight of everything unspoken between them, settling into something that felt, for the first time, entirely certain and unafraid. But even as that quiet moment of connection deepened between them, neither Elena nor Cade could have known that beyond the warm glow of the cabin's fire, in the shadowed depths of the forest surrounding Blackthorn Ridge, a rival pack had already begun watching their territory with calculating interest, drawn by whispers of division and unrest that had spread far beyond the boundaries of Cade's own lands. The peace they had built together, fragile and hard-won, was about to face a threat far greater than internal disapproval or broken tradition, one that would test not only their growing bond, but the very safety of every pup Elena had fought so fiercely to save. Nearly 2 months had passed since Elena's car first veered off that lonely road into the heart of Blackthorn Ridge, and the change in the pups was nothing short of remarkable. Rowan had grown into a sturdy, confident young wolf, his dark coat thick and glossy, his playful energy a constant source of joy around the cabin. Autumn had blossomed into a quick, clever pup with an independent streak that reminded Elena more of Cade with each passing week. Birch had grown steady and loyal, rarely straying far from his siblings, while Wren, though still smaller than the others and moving with a careful, deliberate gait due to her hind legs, had surprised everyone with her determination, learning to compensate for her limitations with a resourcefulness that left even the most skeptical pack members quietly impressed. Elena had settled into a life she never could have imagined for herself only months earlier, one filled with quiet mornings tending to her growing family of pups, afternoons spent in increasingly comfortable conversation with Cade, and evenings watching the sun set over a forest that had transformed from a place of fear into something she was slowly beginning to call home. The tension surrounding her presence had not entirely disappeared, but it had softened considerably, tempered by the undeniable evidence of thriving young lives that would otherwise have been lost. It was on a crisp evening, the pups finally settled and sleeping soundly near the fire, that Ivy arrived at the cabin, with an urgency Elena had not seen from her in weeks, her silver form practically trembling as she shifted quickly into her human shape. "Something is wrong," Ivy said breathlessly. "Scouts have spotted unfamiliar wolves along our eastern border. Strangers, moving carefully, staying just beyond our territory lines, but watching. Cade has called for a gathering." Elena's stomach twisted with immediate unease. "Who are they?" she asked, already reaching for her jacket despite the late hour. Ivy hesitated, glancing nervously toward the sleeping pups. "We believe it is the Thornwood pack," she said quietly. "They have long resented Cade's control over the richest hunting grounds in the region, and rumors of division within our own ranks may have reached them. If they believe our pack is weakened by internal conflict, they may see this as an opportunity to move against us." Elena felt a cold dread settle deep in her chest as the implications of Ivy's words sank in fully. "And they know about the pups?" she asked. "About me?" "It is possible," Ivy admitted. "Word of what has happened here has spread beyond our own borders these past weeks. If the Thornwood pack believes Cade's judgment has been compromised by outside influence, they may try to use that perception against him." Elena's mind raced. torn between the urgent need to understand the full scope of the threat and the fierce protective instinct that refused to leave the pups unguarded even for a moment. "Stay with them," she told Ivy firmly, gesturing toward the sleeping pups. "I need to find Cade." She hurried through the darkened forest, following the increasingly familiar paths that led toward the heart of the pack's territory, her heart pounding with every step. She found Cade standing at the center of a large gathering, his expression carved from granite, Rourke beside him with an equally grim set to his jaw, and dozens of pack members assembled around them in tense, watchful silence. Cade's gaze found hers immediately as she approached, and something flickered across his features, relief mixed with obvious concern. "Elena," he said, moving toward her quickly. "You should not have come. It is not safe." "The pups are not safe either, if what Ivy told me is true," Elena replied, refusing to be dismissed despite the fear coiling tightly in her stomach. "What is happening, Cade? Tell me honestly." Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elena thought he might refuse, might try to shield her from the full weight of the danger gathering at the edges of his territory. Instead, he exhaled slowly and met her gaze with unflinching honesty. "The Thornwood pack has grown bold," he said. "They believe that internal division within Blackthorn Ridge, stirred by disagreements over the choices we have made these past months, has left us vulnerable. They are testing our borders, searching for weakness they can exploit. And if they find it," Elena asked quietly, though she already suspected the answer. "They will move against us," Rourke said flatly, stepping forward with an expression that, for the first time since Elena had met him, carried no trace of his usual disapproval, only grim, focused concern. "And they will not hesitate to use anything, or anyone, they believe will weaken our resolve." "The pups," Elena breathed, the full horror of the implication settling over her like ice water. Cade's expression darkened further. "It is possible," he admitted, "which is why I need you to return to the cabin immediately, and remain there with Ivy and the pups until this situation is resolved. I cannot protect this pack and worry about your safety at the same time. I am not leaving them unprotected," Elena said fiercely, though her voice trembled with barely restrained fear. "But I am also not going to simply hide while you face this threat alone." Cade's expression softened slightly despite the tension of the moment, something achingly familiar passing between them even amid the gathering crisis. "I am not asking you to hide, Elena," he said quietly. "I am asking you to protect what matters most, the same way you have from the very first night we met. Please, trust me to handle what comes next." Elena held his gaze for a long moment, torn between her fierce independence and the undeniable trust that had grown steadily between them over the past months. Finally, she nodded, though the fear in her chest refused to fully settle. "Be careful," she said softly. "Always," Cade replied, reaching out to brush his fingers gently against hers, before turning back toward his gathered pack, his expression once more settling into the commanding authority of an alpha, preparing to defend everything he had built. Elena hurried back toward the cabin, her mind racing with worry, only to freeze in horror as she approached the familiar clearing and found the door hanging open, swinging gently in the cold night breeze. Her heart lurched painfully as she rushed inside, finding the space empty, the warm glow of the fire still crackling in the hearth, but no sign of the pups or Ivy anywhere within the small room. "No," she breathed, panic seizing her chest as she stumbled back outside, scanning the darkened tree line desperately. Ivy, Rowan, Autumn. A soft groan drew her attention to the edge of the clearing, and she rushed forward to find Ivy lying crumpled against the base of a tree, a nasty gash along her temple, her silver fur matted with blood in the moonlight. Elena dropped to her knees beside the injured wolf, checking frantically for further injuries. "Ivy," she said urgently, shaking the wolf gently. "Ivy, wake up. What happened? Where are the pups?" Ivy's eyes fluttered open weakly, her body trembling with pain and exhaustion. "Strangers," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Came from the north. I tried to fight them off, but there were too many. They took Rowan and Autumn. I could not stop them." Elena's blood turned to ice at the words, her mind racing frantically. "And Birch? Wren?" she asked, though dread already told her the answer might be equally terrible. Ivy's gaze shifted weakly toward the cabin. "Inside," she managed. "I hid them beneath the floorboards before I lost consciousness. I do not know if they found them." Elena rushed back inside, her hands trembling as she searched the small room until she found the loose floorboard Ivy had mentioned, prying it open to reveal Birch and Wren huddled together in the small hidden space, terrified but unharmed. Relief flooded through her chest, quickly followed by a fresh wave of desperate fear for the two pups who had been taken. She gathered Birch and Wren gently into her arms, hurrying back outside to where Ivy still lay recovering against the tree, and made a decision that she knew, even as she made it, carried enormous risk. "I need you to stay here and protect these two," Elena said firmly, though her voice shook with barely contained panic. "Can you do that?" Ivy nodded weakly, pulling herself into a sitting position despite her obvious injuries. "Where are you going?" she asked, though the answer seemed to dawn on her even as she spoke the question aloud. "I'm going to find Cade," Elena said, already moving toward the trees, her heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything she had experienced since that first terrifying night in the forest. "And then we are going to get Rowan and Autumn back, whatever it takes." She ran through the darkened forest with a desperation that ignored every ache in her body, following the path back toward the gathering she had left only minutes earlier, praying she would not be too late to warn Cade about the devastating blow the Thornwood pack had already struck against them. The forest around her felt different now, no longer the quiet, watchful presence she had grown accustomed to, but something charged and dangerous, alive with the tension of an approaching conflict that threatened to shatter everything she had helped build over these past 2 months. She burst into the clearing where the pack had gathered, breathless and frantic, and Cade's expression shifted instantly from surprise to alarm as he took in her disheveled, panicked state. "Elena, what happened?" he demanded, closing the distance between them in a few urgent strides. "They took Rowan and Autumn," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Ivy tried to stop them. She is hurt, but Birch and Wren are safe. The Thornwood pack. They came while I was gone. They took them. Cade, they took our pups." A ripple of shocked fury swept through the gathered pack members, and Cade's expression transformed into something Elena had never witnessed from him before, a cold, controlled rage that radiated from every line of his powerful frame. "They will pay for this," he said, his voice carrying a deadly quiet that sent chills down Elena's spine. "No one takes what belongs to this pack and walks away unpunished." Elena reached out, gripping his arm firmly, forcing him to meet her gaze despite the fury burning behind his golden eyes. "We will get them back," she said fiercely, "together. But we need a plan, not just anger. Rowan and Autumn need us to think clearly, not recklessly." Cade's jaw tightened, but something in her steady, determined gaze seemed to anchor him, pulling him back from the edge of blind fury, toward the calculated focus that had made him such an effective leader. "You are right," he said finally, exhaling slowly. "Rourke, gather our fastest trackers. We move within the hour." "I am coming with you," Elena said immediately, before he could even consider suggesting otherwise. Cade's gaze softened slightly despite the tension of the moment, something fierce and protective flickering behind his eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I would not try to stop you even if I thought I could." As the pack began organizing swiftly around them, preparing for what promised to be a dangerous confrontation with the Thornwood pack, Elena felt a fierce, unshakable resolve settle over her, pushing aside the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She had refused to reject even one abandoned pup who had crossed her path these past months, and she was not about to let 2 of her own be taken without a fight, regardless of the danger that awaited them in the darkened forest ahead. Whatever came next, she would face it standing beside Cade, and together, she was certain, they would bring Rowan and Autumn home safely, no matter what the Thornwood pack believed they had gained by striking against the fragile peace Blackthorn Ridge had only just begun to rebuild. The trackers moved swiftly through the darkened forest, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed earth that led steadily northward, deeper into territory Elena had never explored during her months at Blackthorn Ridge. Cade moved beside her with a controlled intensity that radiated barely restrained power, his golden eyes scanning the shadows around them with predatory focus, while Rourke and a dozen other pack members fanned out in careful formation, silent and deadly serious in their pursuit. "How much further?" Elena asked quietly, struggling to keep pace despite the burning exhaustion in her legs. "The border lies just ahead," Cade replied, his voice low and controlled despite the storm of emotion Elena could sense simmering beneath his composed exterior. "Once we cross into Thornwood territory, we must move with extreme caution." Their alpha is not a reasonable creature, and he will not welcome our presence within his lands, regardless of what he has taken from us. Elena nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination as they pressed onward, the trees growing denser and more tangled as they approached the invisible boundary separating the two territories. She thought of Rowan's playful energy, of Autumn's clever, curious nature, and felt her resolve harden further with every step, refusing to entertain the possibility that they might not find the pups safe. They crossed into Thornwood territory just as the first hints of dawn began lightening the eastern sky, the forest here darker and more foreboding, the air carrying an unfamiliar, unsettling stillness that made Elena's skin prickle with unease. Cade signaled for the group to slow their pace, moving with careful, deliberate steps as they drew closer to what the trackers identified as the heart of the rival pack's settlement. Through a break in the trees, Elena finally caught sight of it, a cluster of dwellings built into the base of a rocky hillside, smoke curling lazily from several fires despite the early hour. And there, in a fenced enclosure near the center of the settlement, she spotted two small, familiar shapes huddled together, and her heart nearly stopped with relief and renewed fury at the sight. "There," she whispered urgently, pointing toward the enclosure. "I can see them. They look frightened, but unharmed." Cade's jaw tightened as he assessed the situation, his mind clearly working through the tactical challenge before them. "We cannot simply charge in," he said quietly. "Their numbers likely match or exceed our own within their own territory, and the risk to the pups if violence erupts would be too great." "Then what do we do?" Elena asked, fear and frustration warring within her chest. Before Cade could respond, a deep, commanding voice cut through the quiet morning air, and Elena turned to find a tall, imposing man emerging from one of the largest dwellings, flanked by several wolves, who immediately shifted into human form as they approached, forming a protective barrier between their alpha and the intruders. "Cade Ashgrove," the man called out, his voice carrying a mocking edge that made Elena's skin crawl. "I wondered how long it would take you to come crawling after your precious pups." "Release them, Torin," Cade said, his voice carrying a lethal calm that belied the fury Elena could sense simmering just beneath the surface. "This conflict does not need to escalate further. Return what belongs to my pack, and we will withdraw peacefully." Torin's expression twisted into something cold and calculating as his gaze shifted toward Elena, studying her with open contempt. "This must be the human causing such division within your ranks," he said, his lips curling into a sneer. "I have heard fascinating stories, Cade. An alpha so weakened by sentiment that he allows an outsider to dictate pack law, sparing runts and outcasts that should have been dealt with according to tradition. It is no wonder your borders have grown so easy to breach." Elena felt a surge of protective anger rise within her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, sensing that any outburst on her part might only worsen an already precarious situation. Cade's expression darkened dangerously, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "My pack's traditions are not yours to judge," Cade said coldly. "Return the pups, Torin, or face the consequences of what you have started." Torin laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed unpleasantly through the quiet morning air. "Consequences," he repeated mockingly. "I do not fear an alpha who has grown soft enough to let a human woman challenge his authority in front of his own pack. Perhaps it is time Blackthorn Ridge had leadership that remembers what true strength looks like." The tension in the clearing grew unbearably thick, and Elena watched with mounting dread as the wolves surrounding Torin shifted restlessly, clearly ready to spring into violence at their alpha's command. She glanced toward the enclosure, where Rowan and Autumn remained huddled together, and made a swift, desperate decision. "Wait," she called out, stepping forward despite Cade's sharp intake of breath beside her. "Please. Whatever quarrel you have with Cade, whatever you believe about his leadership, the pups have nothing to do with it. Let me take them. I will leave your territory immediately, and this conflict can be settled between the two of you, without innocent lives caught in the middle." Torin's gaze settled on her with renewed interest, something calculating flickering behind his cold eyes. "Brave words, human," he said slowly, circling closer with predatory grace. "But you misunderstand the situation. Those pups are no longer simply bargaining chips. They represent everything wrong with how Blackthorn Ridge is being led, and I intend to make an example of exactly what happens when an alpha allows weakness to take root within his territory." Cade moved swiftly, positioning himself protectively between Elena and the approaching Alpha, his entire frame radiating barely restrained danger. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal growl that carried unmistakable warning. Torrens' smile widened cruelly. "Careful, Cade," he said softly. "Attacking me within my own territory would be seen as an act of war by every pack in the region. Is that truly a price you are willing to pay, for the sake of a human woman and 2 worthless pups?" The clearing fell into tense, dangerous silence, every member of both packs watching intently to see how the standoff would resolve. Elena's heart pounded frantically as she watched Cade's controlled fury visibly warring against the tactical reality of Torrens' threat, understanding that one wrong move could plunge both packs into a devastating conflict with consequences far beyond anything either of them could easily undo. Then, unexpectedly, it was Rourke who stepped forward, his expression carrying none of the disapproval he had once directed toward Elena, only fierce, unwavering loyalty toward his pack and its leader. "Torren," he said, his voice carrying a calculated confidence that immediately drew the rival Alpha's attention. "Before this escalates further, perhaps we should discuss what you truly want from this confrontation. Surely a war with Blackthorn Ridge, over 2 pups you have no real use for, is not truly in your pack's best interest." Torrens' gaze narrowed suspiciously, though Elena could see the flicker of consideration behind his cold eyes. "And what exactly are you offering, Beta?" he asked slowly. Rourke glanced briefly toward Cade, some silent understanding passing between them despite the tension of the moment. "Territory rights along the northern ridge," he said carefully. "Hunting grounds your pack has long coveted, in exchange for the immediate and unharmed return of both pups, and a formal agreement that this border will remain peacefully respected going forward." Torren considered the offer for a long, tense moment, his gaze flicking between Cade, Elena, and the enclosure, where Rowan and Autumn still huddled together, watching the tense standoff with wide, frightened eyes. Finally, a slow, calculating smile spread across his face. "Very well," he said. "The northern ridge, formally transferred, and I will consider this matter settled. But know this, Cade Ashgrove, your weakness has been noted by every pack in this region. It is only a matter of time before someone else decides to test it far less generously than I have today." Cade's jaw tightened at the insult, but he held his tongue, clearly understanding that securing the pup's safe return outweighed the sting of Torrens' mocking words. The exchange happened swiftly after that. The enclosure opened, and Elena rushed forward the moment the gate swung wide, scooping both trembling pups into her arms, relief flooding through her entire body as she felt their small, frightened heartbeats gradually begin to steady against her chest. "You are safe now," she whispered fiercely, tears of relief pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I have got you both. You are safe." They retreated from Thornwood territory in careful, controlled formation, tension remaining thick in the air, until the familiar boundaries of Blackthorn Ridge finally came into view once more. Only then did Elena allow herself to fully exhale, the adrenaline of the harrowing encounter finally beginning to ebb from her exhausted body. Cade fell into step beside her as they made their way back toward the cabin, his expression heavy with the weight of what had transpired. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "that you were forced to witness such ugliness, and that my pack's internal struggles put you and the pups in danger in the first place." Elena glanced up at him, exhaustion evident in her features but her resolve unshaken. "You did not create Torrens' cruelty," she said firmly. "And despite everything he said, I do not believe for one second that caring for these pups made you weak. It proved exactly the opposite, Cade. It showed everyone watching today that you are strong enough to protect what truly matters, not just what tradition demands you protect." Cade's gaze softened as he studied her face, something achingly tender passing behind his golden eyes, despite the exhaustion evident in his own posture. "I could not have done any of this without you," he admitted quietly. "Not just today, but every day since you first wandered into my territory and refused to leave that pup behind." As they finally reached the cabin, Ivy rushing forward with visible relief to check on Rowan and Autumn, Elena felt a profound sense of belonging settle over her, deeper and more certain than anything she had experienced since arriving in this strange, beautiful, dangerous forest. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever consequences Torrens' parting words might eventually bring, she understood now, with unshakable clarity, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. But Torin's warning lingered in the back of her mind long after the pups had been safely reunited with their siblings, a quiet, unsettling reminder that the peace they had fought so hard to protect remained fragile, and that the true test of everything Elena and Cade had built together might still lie somewhere ahead, waiting within the walls of Blackthorn Ridge itself. In the days following the tense confrontation with the Thornwood pack, a heavy stillness settled over Blackthorn Ridge, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, but before anyone dares believe it will not return. Elena spent those days close to the cabin, tending to Rowan and Autumn as they slowly recovered from the fear of their ordeal, while Wren and Birch stayed close by their siblings' sides, sensing the shift in mood, even if they could not fully understand its cause. Ivy's injuries healed steadily under Elena's careful attention, though the young wolf remained shaken by her failure to protect the pups from the Thornwood raid, a guilt Elena worked patiently to ease with gentle reassurance that no one could have anticipated or prevented what had happened that night. Cade visited each day, though Elena noticed a new weight pressing down on him, a tension that had not fully lifted since their return from rival territory. She understood, without needing to ask directly, that Torin's parting words had struck somewhere deep, a challenge to his authority that could not simply be ignored or forgotten. It was on the 5th evening after their return that Rourke arrived at the cabin, his expression grave, requesting that Elena accompany him and Cade to a gathering of the pack elders. Elena's stomach twisted with immediate unease at the formal request, sensing that whatever waited within that gathering would prove far more significant than any confrontation she had yet faced within Blackthorn Ridge. "The elders have called for a formal council," Cade explained as they walked together toward the ancient meeting ground deep within pack territory, his expression carrying none of its usual composed confidence. "They wish to address, directly and permanently, the question of your continued presence here, and the precedents that have been set regarding pack law these past months." Elena's heart pounded anxiously, though she forced herself to maintain a steady, composed exterior. "And what will they decide?" she asked quietly. Cade's jaw tightened. "That depends," he said, "on arguments made before them tonight, and on choices I have not yet fully voiced, even to myself." The meeting ground, when they finally arrived, proved to be a wide, ancient clearing, ringed by towering stones, weathered smooth by centuries of use, torches casting flickering light across the gathered faces of what appeared to be every significant member of the pack. Elena felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling upon her as she took her place beside Cade, the elder woman who had brought Wren before the pack months earlier, standing prominently among the assembled council, her expression carrying grim, unyielding resolve. "We gather tonight," the elder woman began, her voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing, "to address matters that have divided this pack for far too long. Our alpha has, in recent months, made decisions that challenge traditions older than any of us standing here, decisions influenced heavily by the presence of an outsider who has no true place within our world." Murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd, some supportive of the elder's words, others clearly uncertain, torn between old loyalties and the undeniable evidence of thriving lives that Elena's presence had made possible. The elder continued, her gaze fixed sharply on Cade. "4 pups now live who, by our oldest laws, would not have survived their earliest days," she said. 4 pups who owe their continued existence not to the strength and resilience our traditions demand, but to the intervention of a human woman who does not belong within these woods. Tonight, we ask you, our alpha, to make a final decision. Will you uphold the traditions that have guided this pack for generations, sending this woman, and the precedent she represents away from our territory permanently? Or will you continue down a path that many among us believe threatens the very foundation of what makes us strong? The clearing fell into tense, expectant silence, every gaze fixed on Cade, as he stood tall and composed, despite the enormous weight of the decision being demanded of him. Elena's heart pounded frantically, fear and hope warring painfully within her chest, as she waited to hear what he would say. Cade was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping slowly across the gathered faces of his pack, before finally settling on Elena, something fierce and resolute burning behind his golden eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that immediately silenced every murmur across the clearing. "I have led this pack for many years," he began, "according to traditions I inherited, traditions I once believed were the only path to true strength. But these past months have taught me something I had forgotten, something I once knew intimately, as a pup who should not have survived his own birth, by the very laws some of you wish me to uphold tonight." A ripple of surprise swept through the crowd at his words, many exchanging startled glances at the revelation Cade had rarely spoken of openly. He continued, his voice growing steadier with each word. "Strength is not measured only by what a creature can endure or overcome through sheer physical power," he said. "It is also measured by the courage to protect what is vulnerable, to choose compassion even when tradition demands otherwise, and to recognize that the truest test of a pack's strength lies not in how ruthlessly it can enforce old laws, but in how fiercely it can protect every life within its care, regardless of the challenges that life might present." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes as she listened, watching Cade speak with a conviction that seemed to draw strength from every difficult moment they had faced together these past months. The elder woman's expression tightened with obvious disapproval, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "Elena Marsh did not weaken this pack by refusing to let Rowan, Autumn, Birch and Wren perish, according to old traditions," Cade said, his voice growing firmer with each word. "She strengthened it, by proving that we are capable of more than blind adherence to laws written centuries ago under different circumstances, by different leaders, facing different challenges. She showed this pack, and she showed me personally, what it truly means to refuse to give up on something simply because it seems easier or more traditional to let it go." He turned then, fully facing Elena, and something in his expression shifted into a raw, unguarded vulnerability that Elena had only glimpsed in their most private moments together. "Elena," he said, his voice softening despite the formal weight of the gathering surrounding them, "you wandered into my territory months ago as a stranger, and you have become something far more essential to this pack, and to me personally, than I ever could have anticipated." Elena's breath caught in her throat, as the entire clearing seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting to hear what he would say next. "I am asking you, before this entire pack, to remain within Blackthorn Ridge, not as a temporary guest tolerated for the sake of 4 pups," Cade continued, "but as my mate, bound to this pack and this territory permanently, if you are willing to accept both the honor and the challenges that position carries." A stunned silence swept through the gathered crowd, and Elena felt her own heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone present could hear it. Tears blurred her vision as she stared at Cade, overwhelmed by the depth of sincerity and vulnerability radiating from every line of his powerful frame. The elder woman stepped forward sharply, her expression carrying fierce disapproval. "Alpha," she said urgently, "this decision cannot be made lightly. Binding yourself to a human, elevating pups spared by broken tradition into full status within this pack, these are not choices that can simply be undone once made." "I understand the weight of what I am asking," Cade said, turning to address the elder directly, his voice carrying unwavering resolve. "But I have watched this pack thrive these past months, not despite the changes Elena has brought into our territory, but because of them. Rowan will grow into a strong hunter. Autumn already shows remarkable cleverness that will serve this pack well. Birch's loyalty runs deeper than many wolves born under more traditional circumstances, and Wren, despite the very limitations that once would have condemned her, has shown a resilience and determination that inspires everyone who witnesses it." He paused, his gaze sweeping once more across the gathered crowd, before settling finally back on Elena. "I am not asking this pack to abandon strength or resilience," he continued. "I am asking this pack to redefine what those qualities truly mean, to recognize that compassion and strength are not opposing forces, but complementary ones, that, together, will carry Blackthorn Ridge further into the future than blind tradition ever could alone." The clearing remained tensely silent for a long, agonizing moment, every gaze shifting uncertainly between the elder woman and their alpha, waiting to see how this pivotal confrontation would finally resolve. Then, slowly, Rourke stepped forward, his expression carrying none of the skepticism he had once directed toward Elena, only firm, unwavering support. "I opposed this human's presence when she first arrived," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "I believed, as many of you still do, that her presence represented weakness and unnecessary risk to everything this pack has built. But I have watched her risk her own safety climbing down a treacherous ravine to save a pup she had never met. I have watched her stand fearlessly before Torin of the Thornwood pack, offering herself in exchange for the safe return of pups that were not even her own by blood. Whatever else may be said about her presence here, cowardice and weakness are not among the qualities she has demonstrated. A murmur of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, and Elena felt a fragile hope begin to bloom within her chest as she watched opinion visibly shifting around her. The elder woman's expression remained tight with reluctance, but even she seemed to recognize the tide turning steadily against her position. "Very well," the elder said finally, her voice carrying grudging acceptance rather than genuine approval. "If our alpha is resolved in this decision, tradition allows that the choice ultimately rests with him, provided the full council does not stand unanimously opposed. I will not offer my blessing easily, Cade Ashgrove, but I will not stand in the way of a decision you have clearly made with your whole heart, regardless of how unconventional it may be." Cade's expression softened with visible relief, though his gaze never left Elena's face, waiting with a vulnerability that made her heart ache with tenderness. "Elena," he said softly, the formal weight of the gathering fading into something intensely personal, despite the audience surrounding them. "Will you stay? Will you become part of this pack, and part of my life, permanently?" Elena felt tears finally spill freely down her cheeks as she stepped forward, closing the distance between them until she stood close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. "Yes," she said softly, though her voice carried enough conviction to reach every corner of the silent clearing. "Yes, Cade. I choose you. I choose all of this. I choose Blackthorn Ridge, and Rowan, and Autumn, and Birch, and Wren, and whatever pups might find their way to us in the future. I am not going anywhere." The clearing erupted into a mixture of cheers and howls, the sound rising powerfully into the night sky as pack members shifted between forms, celebrating the resolution of a conflict that had threatened to divide them for weeks. Cade's expression transformed into something Elena had never witnessed from him before, pure, unguarded joy, as he reached out and gently cupped her face in his large, careful hands. "You have changed everything," he said softly, his forehead resting gently against hers. "Not just for me, but for this entire pack, for generations of pups who will grow up knowing that compassion is not a weakness to be trained out of them, but a strength to be celebrated." Elena smiled through her tears, leaning into his gentle touch, feeling a profound sense of belonging settle over her that she had never fully experienced anywhere else in her life before wandering into this forest months earlier. "I only refuse to give up on a few frightened pups," she said softly. "You were the one brave enough to change the laws that would have let them go." Cade's answering smile carried a warmth that outshone every torch flickering across the ancient clearing. "Then let us change them together," he said quietly. "For as long as we both shall lead this pack, and for every life that finds its way to us, deserving of a chance no one else was willing to give them." As the celebration continued around them, the pack embracing this new chapter with a fervor that swept away the last lingering shadows of doubt and division, Elena understood that the story of Blackthorn Ridge was only just beginning, and that whatever challenges still lay ahead, she would face them exactly where she belonged, standing beside the Alpha who had taught her that even the fiercest kings could learn the deepest strength of all, the courage to love without limits, and to protect what mattered most, regardless of what tradition or fear demanded otherwise. Winter arrived early that year at Blackthorn Ridge, blanketing the towering pines in soft, glittering snow, transforming the ancient forest into a quiet, breathtaking wonderland that Elena had never imagined she would call home. Yet within the walls of the cabin, now expanded and reinforced with the help of the pack's most skilled builders, warmth and laughter filled every corner, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Rowan had grown into a magnificent young wolf, his dark coat thick against the winter chill, already showing signs of the strong, confident leader he would one day become within the pack's ranks. Autumn's cleverness had only sharpened with time, and she had taken to shadowing Rourke during his patrols, absorbing lessons in strategy and territory management with an eagerness that delighted even the most seasoned pack members. Birch remained steady and devoted, his loyalty now extending beyond his siblings, to embrace the entire pack that had come to accept him fully as one of their own. And Wren, though her hind legs would never allow her to run with the same speed as her siblings, had discovered a remarkable talent for tracking scents through the snow, her keen nose proving invaluable during the pack's winter hunts, earning her a place of genuine respect that no one could have predicted months earlier. Elena moved through her days with a contentment she had never known before arriving in this forest, her role within the pack evolving naturally from outsider to healer, then to something far more permanent and cherished. She had become, in the months since that pivotal council gathering, an integral part of Blackthorn Ridge's daily life, tending not only to the pups she had first rescued, but to any injured or ailing member of the pack who sought her careful, compassionate care. Even the elder woman who had once fought so fiercely against her presence had softened considerably over time, occasionally seeking Elena out for quiet conversation, sharing stories of the pack's long history that helped Elena understand more deeply the traditions she had challenged, and the reasons those traditions had existed in the first place, even as she remained grateful that Cade had found the courage to reshape them. On a particularly bright winter morning, as sunlight filtered through the snow-laden branches surrounding the cabin, Elena stepped outside to find Cade waiting for her, his expression carrying a warmth and ease that had become far more common since their bond had been formally recognized before the entire pack. Rowan, Autumn, Birch, and Wren tumbled playfully in the fresh snow nearby, their joyful sounds filling the crisp morning air. "You seem thoughtful this morning," Cade observed, moving to stand beside her, his arms settling naturally around her shoulders as they watched the pups play together. Elena leaned into his warmth, smiling softly as she watched Wren determinedly chase after her siblings, her careful, adapted gait no longer holding her back from joining fully in their games. "I was just thinking," she said quietly, "about how far we have all come since that first night by the creek." Cade's gaze followed hers toward the playing pups, something deeply tender softening his features. "It feels like a lifetime ago," he agreed, "and yet, somehow, also like it happened only yesterday." "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked softly, glancing up at him. "Everything that changed because I refused to leave that first pup behind." Cade turned to face her fully, his golden eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch even after all these months together. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You did not simply save 4 pups who would otherwise have been lost, Elena. You saved this pack from a rigid tradition that was slowly hollowing out everything that once made us strong. You saved me from a version of leadership that had forgotten what truly mattered." Elena's eyes filled with grateful tears as she reached up to gently cup his face, the same way he so often did with hers. "And you saved me too," she said softly, "from a life where I might never have found where I truly belonged." As if sensing the tender moment unfolding between their parents, Rowan bounded over through the snow, nudging playfully against Elena's legs, quickly followed by his 3 siblings, all 4 pups clamoring for attention with the boundless enthusiasm only the young could possess. Elena laughed, kneeling down to embrace them all together, feeling Cade's warm presence settle beside her as he joined the joyful pile of affection in the snow. Word had spread far beyond the borders of Blackthorn Ridge over the following months. Stories carried between packs of an alpha king whose wolves brought him orphaned pups, trusting instinctively that whatever creature crossed their path would find shelter and care within his territory. Some packs scoffed at the tales, clinging still to older, harsher traditions, but others, quietly and gradually, began reconsidering practices they had never before thought to question, inspired by the undeniable success and happiness that radiated from Blackthorn Ridge's example. More pups came. In the seasons that followed, some injured, some abandoned by circumstances beyond anyone's control, each one welcomed by Elena with the same unwavering devotion she had shown from that very first night beside the frozen creek. And each time, Cade stood beside her, no longer questioning whether compassion and strength could coexist, but understanding fully now that they were, and always had been, 2 sides of the very same truth. As winter deepened around Blackthorn Ridge, the cabin glowing warmly against the surrounding snow, Elena Marsh sat surrounded by the family she had built from love, defiance, and an unshakable refusal to turn away from anything that needed her help. Cade Ashgrove, once known only as a fierce and untouchable alpha king, had become something far richer in her eyes, a partner, a protector, and a leader wise enough to recognize that the truest measure of his kingdom's strength was not found in the sharpness of its claws or the ruthlessness of its traditions, but in the warmth of the home he had built, alongside the one woman brave enough to refuse rejecting even a single, fragile life. And as the pups settled contentedly around them in the soft evening light, Their small, once fragile bodies now strong and thriving, Elena understood with quiet, certain joy that this forest, this pack, and this remarkable man beside her had become exactly where she was always meant to belong.